Hello everyone, my name is Ed, this is the Rot Gut Review, and today we're talking beginner's bourbon. Let's go! Earlier in the week I did a live stream talking about the basics of whiskey. You can go watch that here. It's very long, it's like 2 hours. We ended up talking about a lot of stuff. You guys were very curious, and I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun to stream. But during that stream, I mentioned that I was going to do a new series talking about good whiskeys for beginners. I'm going to do one of these each week on Wednesday. I'm planning to do a video for each of the major categories. So Scotch, Irish, Bourbon, Rye, Canadian, maybe even Japanese if there's some interest there. But today we're starting with bourbon. And why are we starting with bourbon? Well, because right now it is in the zeitgeist. There is a bourbon boom going on. Everybody's drinking bourbon. In a generation, it has gone from the liquor that poor alcoholics drink in the gutter to the biggest, craziest, coolest thing. Everybody wants to get in on the bourbon boom. However, it can be a little intimidating, right? It can be a little intimidating when you first go into a liquor store and you're looking at all the bourbons. So, I've got a list of 5 that I think are great for beginners. This was a really fun exercise for me, actually, because I had to kind of go back and think about when I first started whiskey, what was I drinking? What did I think was really good? What was something I could appreciate at that time? Because tastes change, and certainly my tastes have changed over time, and I'm drinking some things that I don't think I would have liked back then. So the bourbons on my list are not necessarily the whiskeys that I drink now, but I think they are very good whiskeys for someone just starting out. But before we get into the list, let's hit the basics of bourbon one more time, just so everybody's on the same page. The main 2 misconceptions I hear about bourbon a lot are that 1, bourbon isn't a type of whiskey, that it's its own entirely different liquor. Well, bourbon is a type of whiskey. It is, much like Pinot Grigio is a type of wine, or stout is a type of beer. Bourbon is short for bourbon whiskey. The second misconception I hear a lot is that bourbon can only be made in Kentucky, which isn't true. It is true that Kentucky makes the majority of bourbon, along with some states surrounding it. However, you can actually make bourbon anywhere in the United States. It's America's spirit. Anywhere that is U.S. soil, you can distill bourbon. Maybe not you or me, we'd have to get licensed and get, a still, but you know what I mean, right? So what makes bourbon bourbon? Well, it's a whiskey, so it has to be made from grain. In this case, corn. Bourbon has to be made from minimum 51% corn. Now the other 49% could be more corn, it could be wheat, it could be rye, and I'll show you a couple examples of each style. And we established that it has to be made in America. Yay, USA, USA, USA. It also has to be aged, specifically in oak barrels, new charred oak barrels. The barrel itself is actually what imparts a lot of the flavors onto the whiskey. Probably the majority of the flavors comes from that barrel aging process. Now, like I say, it has to be a new barrel. There's other kinds of whiskeys that you can make that can use barrels that have held a different type of spirit before or have held another whiskey before. Not with bourbon. It's got to be new. It's got to be brand spanking new. And the inside has to be charred. They actually light the inside of it on fire. I hope I'm showing you a picture of it right now because it looks really cool. That caramelizes the wood sugars on the inside of the barrel and also allows the whiskey to penetrate deeper into the wood, so that way you draw out more of that woody flavor. So that's the basics of bourbon. But what about when you're starting out and you want to find the brand that's right for you? Well, here's my recommendations. And these are in no particular order. Also, don't feel like you have to drink these neat. You can drink them on the rocks or in a cocktail, whatever you prefer. And don't feel like you have to go buy a bottle. You can have it at a bar, whatever works for you and your budget and your tastes. So for anyone who's been watching the show for even like 5 minutes, my first recommendation probably isn't going to be surprising. It's Maker's. It's Maker's Mark. As you can see by my various Maker's Mark bottles on my shelf, I drink a lot of Maker's. But your basic Maker's Mark is excellent. It's really solid, and I think it's great for beginners. So this is a wheated mash bill bourbon, meaning that in addition to that corn element, they also have wheat in it. Wheat in a whiskey generally leads to a more bready, easygoing, dare I say, smooth, and somewhat fruity profile. And Maker's is a great example of that. It's bready, it's cherry, it's got this big, sweet, cherry pie kind of note. It's vanilla-y, it's slightly caramely, and there's a little bit of wood spice there, but not so much that it's gonna overpower you and really kick you in the teeth. Now, if that sounds good to you, but you want maybe a little bit more spice, maybe a little bit of allspice or cinnamon, you might consider Maker's 46. Maker's 46, I think, is also a great beginner's whiskey. However, I will caution you, it is a little bit more spicy. It's got more of that cinnamon allspice kind of thing, and that's from the oak staves that they've added to that barrel. They use a special proprietary set of staves to give Maker's 46 its particular taste. Go for that one if you like the spice. If you like a little bit more kick, that's a great one for you. And if you find out you like that wheated mash bill, there's a lot of other bourbons out there with wheat in them. Some of them very famous, like Weller and Pappy. You're probably not going to find those. I'm going to be honest with you. Like ever. My second choice for beginners is Woodford Reserve. Now, for me, I'm not the biggest fan of Woodford Reserve myself. I don't care for it all that much. However, for someone just starting out in bourbon, this is a good way to go. It's very caramely, it's a little floral, it's a little citrusy. There certainly is a woody, sawdusty aspect, but nothing that is really, really overpowering. And if you want some more of that wood, if you want something with a little bit more spice and little tannic bite, you can then upgrade to the Woodford Double Oaked. That is definitely more oaky and is something a little bit more what I like. But for starters, try the Woodford. Number 3 is a very famous bourbon with a healthy rye component, and that's Wild Turkey. Wild Turkey is great. The Russells, their distillers, are fantastic at what they do. As opposed to Maker's with that wheated mash bill, Wild Turkey highlights the rye portion of the mash bill. Now, it is still bourbon, so it's made with majority corn. However, that rye shines in this whiskey. Rye tends to be a little bit spicier. It gives it a little pepper, a little black tea. It is still vanilla, it's still caramely. However, now it has a little bit more black pepper punch. And you may be thinking, well, hey, that's kind of what you said about Maker's 46. Well, yeah, because those spicy flavors can come from different places. Sometimes they come from a barrel, sometimes they come from the grain. Now, rye spice and barrel spice do tend to be a little bit different, in my opinion. I think rye runs a little bit more vegetal, a little more eucalyptus-y, so it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison, but you can get spice from different places when you're making your whiskey. Now, if you don't like spice, let's talk about a whiskey that I think would be perfect for you. Uncle Nearest. Now, you're gonna notice this doesn't say bourbon on it. Why is that? Well, because it's a Tennessee whiskey. Tennessee whiskey is essentially bourbon. It's a bourbon by any other name. Don't say that to Tennesseans though, they get very mad about that. But it is true. It's made out of 51% corn, it's aged just like bourbon is. However, it also goes through an extra process. That's the Lincoln County process, where they drip the distillate through charcoal to mellow it. And Uncle Nearest is a very mellow whiskey. It's all brown sugar and molasses, but it's still really, really flavorful. It's not thin, it's not lacking, it's just got this really nice, beautiful, beautiful caramel, dulce de leche kind of taste. The one caveat with Uncle Nearest is that up until recently they were sourcing all of their whiskey from George Dickel, and now they're going to be going over to distilling it themselves. So the profile may change. I expect they'll try and keep it as consistent as possible, but anytime you start changing things like that, you know, there's bound to be some differences. So keep that in mind for the future. There may be some changes in the brand. Now, before we get to the last one on my list, I do want to have a couple honorable mentions that for one reason or another I didn't put on the list proper. So these are freebies. One, Ezra Brooks. I really like Ezra Brooks. It's a little spicy. It's got kind of a plummy thing for me. It's good. And it's cheap. It won my Bourbons under $15 blind flight. And if you want to go watch that. Also, I wanted to mention, well, wait, I guess this isn't an honorable mention exactly, but Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare. They are very good beginner's whiskeys. They're sweet. They're very easygoing. Buffalo Trace is quite vanilla-y, caramely, and Eagle Rare has a really nice, bright cherry note. So, you know, good flavors, good flavors. The only thing is that if you aren't on the coasts or in a primary market, they have gotten so hard to find. Yes, even the regular old BT has gotten hard to find. Like here in Milwaukee, people snap that stuff up as soon as they see it and it's gone. That may be different in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. But given that I don't want to recommend people go out hunting for things they're never going to be able to find and just bothering liquor store clerks, just keep in mind, some places you're just never going to find Buffalo Trace products. But our fifth entry, rounding out the list, is Elijah Craig. Elijah Craig Small Batch is really good. Really good. I get a really fun nutty mixture. It's like mixed nuts, like Brazil nuts and cashews in there. Also, it's got a dark cherry note, which you may notice, cherry is a pretty common bourbon flavor. But that cherry is more of that dark sour cherry, rather than the really bright maraschino of makers. And along with the nuttiness and the cherry, you get a nice woody backbone. There's a good amount of wood spice in this. And if you find out you like that, you can always upgrade to the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, because that stuff is awesome. So that has been my 5 bourbons for beginners. If you have any recommendations for people starting out in whiskey, or specifically in bourbon, please feel free to leave them down below in the comments. Also, you know, why don't you hit the like button and subscribe while you're down there. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you. But until next time, make sure to stay safe, stay healthy, and stay rotten.